So you want to learn about blocking. Maybe you've seen this term on the internet and you're not quite sure what it means. Or maybe you know what blocking is, but you're not sure why on earth you would bother to do it to your knit or crochet project. Or maybe you already know all of this and you're just interested in learning a new method of blocking. Well, I'm going to cover all of that in this video. So we're going to be going through what is blocking, why you should block and the benefits of blocking, when you should block, and how to block different yarn fibres, as well as going through the materials you're going to need. I'm going to provide a few different options for different budgets as well. The concepts we're going to learn can be applied to any knit or crochet project, but I am going to be focusing in on what's best for granny squares. The basics of blocking is we would take a piece like this granny square and then we would pin it or lay it out into the shape we want it to be, so that shape. And then we would apply water and or heat to it and then let it cool down or dry depending on what method of blocking you're doing. And then you would then end up with a lovely even granny square. So with blocking, I like to use sort of an analogy of curling hair. So if you think about you've got hair like mine and you want it to be curly for the day, you've got a few different options, but we can either use heat or water to set the curl. So heat, we could use like a curling tong. Or if we want to use water, we could wet the hair, put it in a curler and let it dry sort of overnight, or we could blow dry it. So with that, the hair would then be curly, so we've set the shape of the hair. So with blocking, think about it like this. What we're doing is we're using heat and or water to set the shape of our stitches and our project. And if you think about it, some fibres such as wool is actually sheep hair, so there is similarities there as well. But we are going to be covering other fibres as well, such as cotton and acrylic. So why would you bother blocking your knit or crochet project? Well, it comes with a whole range of benefits. One benefit is that it can help even out an uneven tension. So if you've got bigger or smaller stitches on the same row, it can really help with that. It can also help with helping the fabric lay flat or into the shape that it needs to be, particularly if we think about knitting stockinette or sometimes granny squares. You can find that the edges or the corners roll in and curl in, so blocking this will sort of set it into that square shape and make those corners pop out. If you've made something lacy, it will really help that lace pattern pop and those holes open up. It will also help with drapes. If you've got a particularly stiff project, blocking it actually involves stretching out your work so that when it dries it's actually a lot more drapey. So the process of blocking usually makes the item a little bit bigger as well, because it does involve a little bit of stretch. So that you can actually use that for your benefit. If you've perhaps knitted a jumper that's slightly too small, slightly too tight for you, you can then block it and it just adds that little bit of extra width and length so that it fits you a little bit better. So like I said, there's a whole range of benefits for blocking. So you're probably wondering, do I have to block my knit or crochet project? Do I have to block my granny squares? You absolutely do not. It's completely personal choice. I prefer to block all of my knitting, but I only block some of my crochet. And actually, unless I'm making a blanket that uses lots of different squares in it and not just sort of the same type of granny square over and over again, I don't actually block my granny squares, especially if they're going into a big heavy project like a blanket or a cardigan or something like that, because I find the process of joining them sort of stretches out the square enough that there's not any point me blocking the squares individually. However, if I'm making a sampler blanket, for example, such as the Yorkshire Crochet Along blanket, which is a crochet along I'm hosting at the minute, so that involves 12 different granny square patterns, and even if you crochet them with the same hook to the same tension, your squares might be slightly different in sizes and shapes because those patterns are different. So I do recommend blocking if you're making something like a sampler blanket, because like I said in the benefits of blocking, that it can slightly increase the size, so we can actually pin out the squares all to the same size. So with the Yorkshire blanket, if you're using a fingering weight yarn, you would pin it out to 7 inches along one side, or a DK weight you would do 9 inches along one side, because that's what the pattern tells you to do. And that means that all of our squares are then the same size and shape, so our blanket overall looks more even when we join all those different squares together. However, again, this is entirely optional. I can recommend you do something. If you really don't want to block any of your projects, It'll be fine. You do you. Crochet and knitting is supposed to be enjoyable. Don't feel like I'm telling you that you have to do something. So before I move on to the 3 different methods of blocking that I'm going to cover in this video, there are a few things we need to talk about first. The first thing to think about is that when we're blocking something, like I said previously, it usually slightly increases the size depending on how much stretch we're putting into that square. For the Yorkshire blanket, so that's the blanket that's behind me, and for these squares I recommend a size after blocking of 7 inches. So when you're crocheting your squares should be less than 7 inches along one side, or at the very maximum literally 7 inches, but your square might be, one square might be 6.5 inches, one square might be 6.75 inches. Once we block them, they'll all be to the same size. So we need to keep size in mind and block ever so slight, make our work ever so slightly smaller than the size we want it to be. Another thing that's vital is the fibre content of your yarn. So yarn is made up of different fibres and different blends of different fibres, and they kind of come into 3 categories. We have animal fibres such as wool and alpaca. We have man-made fibres such as acrylic or nylon. Those are essentially plastics. And then we also have plant-based fibres, so cotton and bamboo and fibres like that. And these fibres behave differently when they're crocheted and knitted up, and each individual yarn will have a different method of blocking that works best for that yarn depending on that fibre content. The other thing you need to think about as well is on the labels of your yarn. Let me get a label to show you. So I've got a label for a yarn that I use for one of the squares we're going to be using in the tutorials at the end of the video. And this is Stylecraft Naturals Bamboo and Cotton, and it's actually the yarn that I'm using for my second version of the Yorkshire blanket. So this yarn is a bamboo cotton blend. It says on the label that it's 60% bamboo and 40% cotton. I have never ever blocked bamboo before, so I'm going to be trying a couple of different methods on this yarn to see which one is the best. And on this it has care instructions for the yarn on the label. So those symbols, you get them on clothes labels as well. It shows like whether it's machine washable, what temperature it's machine washable at, whether you can tumble dry it or iron it. And for this yarn, it actually is a cool machine wash at 30 degrees and a cool tumble dry. So to me, that indicates that this fibre doesn't particularly like heat. And if we think about the fibres of yarn, is that these yarns can react differently when you apply heat or water to, so that's something to keep in mind. Once we know how the fibres go to react to the heat and the water, we can then pick the method of blocking that we're going to do. So in this video, we're going to be talking about wet blocking, spray blocking and steam blocking. These are 3 different methods. They're all methods that I've used myself and I can recommend, but some of these methods work better for different yarn fibres. For example, acrylic yarn, which is essentially plastic, really, if you try and use water with no heat to block acrylic yarn, you get very, very little shaping from it because you're essentially just wetting the plastic. Whereas if we apply a little bit of heat to that, it almost softens and melts those fibres just a little bit so that we can then block it into the correct shape. So for acrylic yarn, I recommend a method that's more heat than water. Whereas if we think about something like non-superwash wool, so wool that hasn't been treated, and if you put that wool in the washing machine it will turn into felt because of the heat and the agitation in the washing machine. So we need to be really gentle with the way that we block this yarn. We want to use cool water and we want to lay it out flat with minimal agitation. So really pay attention to the instructions on that yarn label, and if you're ever unsure, I would always recommend starting with spray blocking because I find it's the most gentle form of blocking. But as you become more confident with blocking and working out what works best for different yarns, you should confidently then be able to think, right, this yarn has this yarn content, it has these instructions, so I think that this yarn will work better for steam blocking, for example. So it does take a bit of practice, and I will give you some guidelines as we go through those 3 methods of blocking of which yarns are good for that particular method. So the final thing we need to think about before we actually get to those tutorials for the 3 methods of blocking are the materials we're going to use to block our items. So we're going to need things to sort of apply the water or the heat, and we're also going to need something to keep the granny square in its shape while we apply that water or heat to it. So I'm going to be going through various different products, some I recommend, some I don't, range of different price levels as well. And before we move into that, a quick disclaimer, this video is completely unsponsored. I bought everything I'm going to be talking about in this video and it's things I choose to use or choose not to use, so completely unbiased opinions. You may disagree with me on the things that I recommend and the things I don't recommend. Let me know if you do disagree with me in the comments, but yeah, I'm going to be giving you my complete honest opinion. So the first thing I want to talk about that you might have seen on social media is a blocking board. So this is a bit of plywood with some holes drilled into it and some wooden dowels that you can pin your square out just like I've done here and then apply your water or heat to it. I really don't like these and I don't recommend them, and I know they're really popular and people are probably going to disagree with me, but there's two reasons why I don't like them. So these holes are drilled at specific points, but you can't sort of get a specific size unless you've got the holes of the drills there. So for example, I recommend the squares are 7 inches in the Yorkshire crochet along if you're using fingering weight yarn. And what if 7 inches doesn't line up with any of these holes? Well, then your squares aren't going to be the right size. We can't make those minute changes of size. And then there's one other reason why I don't recommend these blocking boards. So if you can see here, I'm using my lacy granny square pattern. I have a tutorial for this, I'll link it up here. For lace, I like to aggressively block, so I really give it a good stretch because it really opens up those holes, and that's pretty hard to do with this without it doing this sort of wave shape here. Even if you stuck a dowel like all the way through, it still ends up with that sort of wave shape, and I really don't like it. And I wouldn't recommend this for the Yorkshire sampler blanket because you're going to end up with these sort of uneven, the sides of your squares aren't going to be straight basically. However, this is really good if all you want to do, if all you want to do is get rid of that curl and just define the corners of your granny square. You're not doing an aggressive block and you just want those corners defined. This is good for that. For more sort of aggressive blocking, I don't recommend. So what I recommend you spend your money on, and this is actually going to be a lot cheaper than those blocking boards because they can, they can get quite expensive, is a pack of pins. And here is a pack from Knit Pro. These are the ones that I like, the Knit Pro ones, and they do this. So that is a T-pin here, and hopefully you can see, so this is quite a thick pin, and you want that because when you're putting all of that tension, all of that stretch on your granny square, you want something thick that's not going to bend in or sort of fold in under that tension. So you need something thick. And I also like these because they're rust proof, and not all pins are rust proof, and you really don't want to be using something that will rust. You're going to be applying water to the pin and then you'll get rust stains on your crochet and knitting. I've done it before. No, really be careful that you get rust proof pins. They don't have to be these Knit Pro ones, they can be any ones you want, but these are specifically labelled as T-pins for locking lace garments, and these I 100% recommend. They aren't too expensive either. I can't remember the price usually, so I'll pop it up here how much it is on Amazon at the minute. So if you've got a little bit more money to spend, you could get something like this. So this is from Knit Pro again, and these are their rainbow blockers. So I'll show you. I'm hoping that you can see these because they're so small. So you can see here we've got like a plastic handle with all of these pins in a row. And like I said with this method, so you see how we've got these lines here, you can actually get that with the T-pins as well. Whereas if you've got something like this, you can kind of pull it all into a straight line. So these are great. These aren't cheap though. I think I got mine for about £17, but it was quite a while ago. But if you've got the budget, these are really good as it really speeds up the pinning out process when you're blocking. These are also really good for if you're wanting to aggressively block a sweater as well, because you've got so many here, so many pins to just get right in there down the sides of the sweater. So we've talked about how we're going to be sort of stretching out, putting that tension making the shape of our granny squares, what are we actually going to be pinning to? Well, the cheapest option is probably something you already have, and that is a thick towel. Fold it over several times and then you can pin it straight into it. And that was actually how I first did blocking, is I folded up a towel on a bed, and then I used not the T-pins because I bought those after, I just used regular sewing pins, pinned it out, sprayed it with water. And that was when I got the rust stones, and I actually got blocking pins after that. But you can just use a towel for the surface that you pin to. However, if you're willing to spend a little bit of money, about £10 on Amazon here in the UK, you can get a pack of these. So these are children's play mats, and they are basically just foam jigsaw pieces that you can jigsaw together to create a surface that you can pin onto. And I think it'd be easier if I show you the non-textured side. Hopefully you can see here we've got lots of holes where over the years I've pinned lots of things. And these are a really great budget option if you sort of want to move up from a towel, because when you're pinning to a towel, the pins can slip out and slide, or you can get the pin going all the way through. So these blocking boards are great. I use them for years. This is sort of my second pack of them, because once they get get a lot of holes into them, once you've blocked lots and lots of things on them, they sort of start falling apart a little bit. However, the problem with them is if you have a look, they are really, really thin. You can get different thickness levels, but generally the cheap ones are very, very thin. And the problem with this is, I'll show you, I don't use these children's ones anymore. I'll show you what I actually use to block now, but I did want to show you, so I'm blocking out some swatches here. It's a very dark green, so you might not be able to see it. So these are knit swatches for a cardigan I'm planning to knit, and you can see I've got all my pins pinned into my swatches, and the main problem with these are, because they're so thin, the back is full of pin spikes. I hope you can see that. I can't quite tell in the camera if you are. So yeah, so these are good, but you do have to be careful. So what I tend to do is actually put a towel underneath them, then put them on, and then that gives me enough thickness for the pins to get a good grip on. The next step up, which can get a little bit pricey, I managed to get the set that I use half price, but the set that I use is from Knit Pro again, and they are these blocking mats. And as you can see, if I hold it up next to the children's play mats, it's a lot thicker. I would probably say at least 2, if not 3 times thicker than the children's play mat. So I've never ever managed to push a pin through to the back. And not all of them have this, but many of them have this grid on it, and these are inch squares. So do you remember I was talking about blocking a square to a particular size? So that's 7 inches along one side, or 9 inches if you're using DK weight yarn. You don't actually have to get a measuring tape out, because you can just block it to this grid, and that is so handy. And these are the ones I actually used to block the squares on my original Yorkshire sampler blanket. So like I said earlier, I'm going to be doing tutorials for 3 different types of blocking. So it doesn't matter which of the 3 methods you end up using, you're going to need pins and blocking mats. But what will change is the tool that we use to apply the water and or the heat to the crochet. And for wet blocking, you're going to need a bowl that we're going to fill with water. For spray blocking, you're going to need a spray bottle filled with water. And for steam blocking, you're either going to need an iron with a steam function or a clothes steamer. And I bought this clothes steamer especially for this video. So for clothes steamers, you need to find one that works horizontally as well as vertically, because some of them only work vertically and they leak if you try to use them horizontally. So this one is from a brand called Home Easy, and this was recommended to me by Heather of HG Designs Crochet. She does some great granny square patterns. I'll link her channel down below. So I'm going to be trying this out for the first time in this video, and I will give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down in the comments about this particular steamer, if I recommend it or not. So with wet blocking, I recommend this method for animal fibres, particularly wool and alpaca, so yarns that are sort of more than 50% of those animal fibres. I find that this works really well, and it's the method that I did use on my Yorkshire Crochet Along blanket. So this method doesn't work very well for acrylic yarns. Like I said earlier, they're plastic and water doesn't really do a lot to them. But I do find that this can work with plant-based yarns, so yarns made of cotton cotton, but you have to be careful because some of those plant-based fibres can really stretch a lot when they're wet. So it might not be suitable for every plant-based yarn, which is why I prefer either spray blocking or steam blocking for plant-based yarns. So for wet blocking, fill your bowl with lukewarm water, and this part is optional, but I like to add a little splash of a no rinse wool wash to the water. I don't particularly recommend this one or this brand over any other brand that I've tried. I find that they all work very similarly. So place your square into that bowl of water, and I like to squeeze the square underwater and let go to allow it to absorb the water, a bit like you would do when you're using a sponge. I then leave it to soak in the water for at least 15 to 20 minutes to really saturate those fibres. After that time is up, squeeze as much water out as you possibly can, but do not wring it, or you might stretch it in the wrong way and it might then come out of shape. Now lay the square on your mat and pin it to the shape that you want. Some squares will only require a pin in each of the 4 corners, but some squares, such as square 8 of the Yorkshire Crochet Along, need quite an aggressive blocking and a lot of stretching. So in this case, you might want to run pins around all 4 sides of your square. Now leave this square for at least a few days to dry. If you want to speed this up, you could set a fan over it, but I find it works best if you let it evaporate naturally and leave it pinned out for several days. Now remove the pins and your blocking is done. So for that method of blocking, we got our square wet before we pinned it out. However, for the next 2 methods of blocking, we're actually going to be pinning out the square dry and then applying the water or steam. So the next method we'll go through is spray blocking. I find this works really similarly to wet blocking, but doesn't give such a good result, if that makes sense. And it's also a lot quicker to dry because you're applying less water. I recommend this method for most fibres apart from acrylic. It's quite a gentle way to start blocking as well. If you're nervous about blocking, this is where I would start. This is actually where I start. I only spray blocked for several years before I moved on to wet and steam blocking. And if you've got a yarn and you're not sure how it's going to react to heat or water in the blocking process, I recommend starting with spray blocking and seeing what results you get, because I find it's one of the more gentler methods. So spray blocking is quite straightforward. First, pin out your square dry, then spray it with water. When you're spraying it, you want it to be damp, but you don't want it to be soaking wet because it will take forever to dry. Just like wet blocking, I recommend leaving it to dry for several days before unpinning. And finally, steam blocking. So steam blocking I recommend for acrylic yarns. That's because the heat slightly melts and softens those fibres, so you're able to block it. I have also used steam blocking for other fibres before, wool, cotton, things like that. I tend to do this if I either haven't got the space to leave something out to dry for such a long time, or if I don't want to leave something for days to dry, I just want it done now so I can wear it or use it. That's when I'd use steam blocking because it's a lot quicker. So to steam block, pin out your square dry and then hover the iron or steamer a few inches away from the crochet surface. Then let the steam run across the whole item. Do not let the surface of the iron or the steamer touch your crochet or your knitting, or you run the risk of either melting the fibre or potentially burning the fibre. So leave it pinned out until it's completely cool and dry and then unpin. So when you're applying heat to acrylic, you need to be really careful that you don't do something called killing the acrylic. This is where you over melt those fibres and it just completely loses any sort of shape at all. So you need to be careful with that. So start on a low heat and move up if you need to. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. If you're looking for something to watch next, I'll pop a couple of videos up here and I will see you next time.